Close your eyes for a moment and remember the smell of your grandfather's cabin. Not the sharp scent of pine cleaner or plastic insulation, but real wood smoke, thick, earthy, slightly sweet. That smell wasn't just comfort, it was information. It told you there was heat, yes, but more than that, it told you someone knew how to survive. For centuries, the hearth was not decoration. It was the center of gravity in every home. Meals were cooked there, water was boiled there, stories were told there, and when the fire finally burned low and morning came, what remained was never dismissed as waste. The gray, powdery residue left behind wood ash was carefully gathered, stored, and respected. It was known simply as garden gold. In our modern world of plastic jugs, brightly colored labels, and chemical blue liquids promising instant growth, we've lost touch with this quiet alchemy. But for those who still remember the old ways or are willing to relearn them, wood ash is not trash. It is a concentrated essence of the forest itself. Every log burned carried decades of sunlight, minerals pulled deep from the earth, and stored strength. When the fire consumes the wood, it leaves behind what could not burn: potassium, calcium, magnesium, the skeletal elements of plant life. Up to 70% of wood ash is calcium carbonate. That alone makes it a powerful ally against acidic soils, the kind that silently weaken crops, stunt roots, and invite disease. But ash does more than adjust numbers on a soil test. It restores balance. When scattered lightly across garden beds, it strengthens plant cell walls, so tomatoes stand firm instead of collapsing under summer storms. It hardens tissues just enough to discourage soft-bodied pests. Slugs and snails creeping in under moonlight retreat when they meet that dry mineral barrier. Yet the elders always warned ash demands respect. Not all ash is equal. Only clean, untreated hardwoods, oak, maple, beech were trusted. No painted lumber, no treated boards, and never ash that had been soaked by rain, because water leaches away potassium first, stealing the very nourishment the soil needs. They also knew never to mix ash with nitrogen-rich fertilizers. Combined carelessly, the two don't feed plants, they escape into the air as ammonia, leaving nothing behind. Beyond the garden, wood ash served the household itself. Mixed with water, it became lye, the foundation of soap. Sprinkled into dust baths, it protected chickens from mites and lice. Rubbed gently, it polished silver and cleaned glass. One fire fed many needs. To reclaim wood ash today is not just an act of gardening, it is an act of remembrance. Each handful reconnects us to a time when nothing was wasted, when survival depended on understanding cycles instead of fighting them. When we spread ash onto soil, we are not merely fertilizing plants. We are listening to the whispers of the hearth and carrying its wisdom back into the earth. There is a kind of power that does not come in sealed containers or glossy packaging. It cannot be stabilized, trademarked, or stored on a shelf for years. It is alive, restless, and quietly at work all around us. Yeast belongs to this older category of power, the kind humanity learned to cooperate with, long before it learned to control. Most people meet yeast in the kitchen, folded into dough and forgotten once the bread rises. But to those who look closely, yeast is not an ingredient. It is a workforce, a living engine made of countless single-celled organisms, each one feeding, multiplying, and transforming its environment. Long before laboratories gave it a Latin name, farmers understood its effects through observation alone. Imagine two cucumber plants growing side by side in the same cool spring soil, same seed stock, same sunlight, same watering schedule. One receives nothing more than plain water. The other is given a simple brew, warm water, a spoonful of sugar, and a pinch of baker's yeast left to wake and breathe. Within days, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. The yeast-fed plant does not simply grow taller. Its leaves darken to a deep, waxy green. The stems thicken. The internodes shorten. It looks less like a plant struggling to survive and more like one that expects abundance. By harvest time, the gap widens. Flowers hold longer. Fruit sets more reliably. The yield quietly multiplies, sometimes doubling, sometimes tripling without any sign of stress. This is not coincidence. It is biology responding to partnership. Yeast produces natural growth. Regulators substances modern science calls cytokinins and auxins. These compounds act like permission slips inside the plant, signaling cells to divide, roots to branch, and tissues to strengthen. When introduced into soil, yeast does not replace nutrients. It activates them. It wakes up dormant processes already waiting beneath the surface. But the deeper effect happens underground. As yeast settles into the root zone, it competes with harmful microbes for space and resources. Disease pressure drops not because pathogens are killed, but because they are crowded out. Minerals locked in soil particles begin to move. Nutrients once inaccessible are quietly released and carried toward the roots. What makes this method remarkable is not just its effectiveness, but its humility. For less than the cost of a cup of coffee, anyone can create a living tonic using materials already at hand. No dependency, no supply chain, no instructions printed in fine ink, just warm water, sugar, and time. This is why yeast has always belonged to survival culture. From fermented foods to soil health, it represents continuity, the same biological allies supporting human life across kitchens, fields, and centuries. When you pour a yeast brew into your garden, you are not applying a product. You are extending an invitation, and in return, the soil breathes back. A garden does not ask for the same thing all year long. It breathes with the sun, tightens with cold stretches, with heat and rests when the light fades. Those who treat it as a static system, watering the same way, feeding the same way season after season, never quite understand why results vary. But those who learn to listen discover that timing matters as much as ingredients. Long before printed labels and standardized ratios, growers relied on formulas carried in memory. These were not theories. They were answers earned through loss, failure, and quiet success. Each brew existed for a reason, and each had a moment when it mattered most. When plants are young, their hunger is simple and urgent. They are building leaf stem and structure. Nitrogen is the signal they crave, the green light that tells them to expand. This is when the garden offers its first paradox. The very weeds that compete for space can be turned into fuel. Gather them before they seed. Chop them finely. Submerge them in rainwater, not tap water, and add a small handful of wood ash to buffer acidity and release minerals. Then wait. Over the next 2 weeks, the mixture darkens and thickens. Bubbles rise. The smell turns sharp, then deep. This is not decay, it is extraction. The plants you removed are surrendering their stored nitrogen back into solution, diluted 1 part tea to 10 parts water. This brew delivers fast, visible growth without shocking the soil. Leaves broaden, color deepens. The garden responds with momentum. As summer approaches and flowers begin to form, priorities shift. Growth alone is no longer enough. The plant must hold weight. It must support fruit. Calcium and potassium become critical not in excess but in balance. This is where formulas merge rather than compete. A yeast brew already alive with microbial activity becomes a carrier. Stir in finely sieved wood ash and allow it to settle briefly. The ash provides potassium for stem strength and calcium for cell integrity. The yeast ensures these minerals are not lost or locked away. Together they feed structure as much as size. Then there are eggshells, the quiet mineral reserve of the kitchen. When burned clean and dark, their calcium becomes reactive. Steeped in vinegar, it dissolves into a form plants can absorb almost immediately. Applied as a foliar spray, it bypasses soil, entirely correcting deficiencies before damage appears. This is how generations avoided blossom end rot without knowing its name. For soil that has been worked hard or pushed beyond recovery, even stronger measures exist. Wood ash can be boiled to unlock nutrients more fully, creating a mineral concentrate. Used sparingly and sometimes combined with trace elements, like boron, it supports fruit set during extreme heat when pollination falters. These are not shortcuts, they are conversations. Each brew answers a seasonal question the garden is asking, and when used with care, they replace guesswork with rhythm. This is not feeding plants, it is feeding time itself. Every harvest begins underground long before the first leaf ever sees the sun. What survives the heat of summer, the weight of fruit, and the violence of wind is decided in darkness. Roots are not accessories to growth, they are its insurance policy. When they are shallow, plants live on borrowed time. When they are deep and resilient, plants endure neglect, drought, and mistakes. For most modern gardeners, roots are invisible and therefore ignored. Seedlings are set gently into shallow holes, watered from above, and expected to manage on their own. But earlier growers understood something fundamental. A plant does not grow toward light alone. It grows toward security. One of the oldest lessons came from the willow. Long before plant hormones were named, people noticed that willow cuttings rooted almost anywhere. In cold water, in poor soil, even in neglect. The reason lies in compounds. The tree produces naturally substances that signal cells to divide and heal. These compounds do not force growth. They encourage it when conditions are uncertain. When willow was unavailable, practical minds looked elsewhere. Aspirin, derived from the same chemical family, became a substitute. Dissolved in water, it does two things at once. It stimulates root formation and it strengthens the plant's internal defenses during its most vulnerable stage. This is not speed, it is stability. Then there is the red onion. Sharp, pungent, and overlooked, it carries natural antimicrobial properties that protect fresh cuts from rot and infection. Blended with water and combined with a mild aspirin solution, it creates a rooting aid that does not sterilize the environment but guides it. Pathogens are discouraged, not annihilated. Balance is preserved. These methods were not about producing instant roots. They were about producing roots that could survive stress. A cutting that roots slowly but securely will outlive one that rushes and collapses. Tomatoes reveal this truth clearly. Instead of being placed delicately at surface level, they were buried deep, often sideways, with only the top leaves exposed. Every tiny hair along the buried stem transformed into a root. The plant did not panic, it adapted. A pinch of wood ash in the planting hole reduced shock and stabilized pH, giving the new roots a calm environment to expand. These practices share a single philosophy: prepare for hardship before it arrives. Deep roots do not advertise themselves. They reveal their value only when water disappears, when heat persists, when support fails. In the garden, as in life, strength built early is quiet, but it carries everything that comes later. When you tend to the root, first survival becomes less about reaction and more about readiness. A self-sufficient home does not begin in the garden, it begins in the kitchen. This is where most cycles are either broken or completed. Modern life teaches us to discard without thought, to seal waste in plastic and push it out of sight. But older households understood something quieter and far more powerful. Nothing that once fed life should be treated as worthless. What we call scraps are simply nutrients waiting for a new form. Banana peels softening on the counter are reservoirs of potassium. Buried or fermented, they strengthen flowering plants, deepen color, and support fruit development. Coffee grounds, often thrown away by the handful, carry nitrogen and acidity, exactly what blueberries, hydrangeas, and woodland plants evolved to receive. Used thoughtfully, they do not overwhelm. They return familiarity to the soil. Even water itself carries memory. The cloudy liquid left behind after rinsing rice contains starches and trace minerals. Poured at the base of leafy greens, it feeds soil microbes first, not the plant directly. That distinction matters. Healthy soil does not force growth, it invites it. The kitchen alchemist learns quickly that restraint is part of respect. Oily leftovers suffocate soil. Salt disrupts life. These materials belong to disposal, not recycling. The difference between nourishment and harm is not intention, but understanding. Dilution becomes a guiding principle. Living fertilizers are potent because they are active. Used undiluted, they overwhelm the very systems they are meant to support. Thinned properly, they integrate. Plants respond not with shock, but with steadiness. Leaves darken gradually. Growth becomes even not explosive. Observation replaces instruction. Shiny, deep green foliage signals contentment. Pale leaves or weak stems are not failures, they are messages. Each plant communicates its needs openly to those who slow down enough to notice. This approach does more than grow vegetables, it rebuilds a relationship. When you step outside carrying a bucket of diluted tea or a jar of cooled rice water, you are no longer performing a task. You are continuing a conversation that began generations ago. One where knowledge was carried in hands, not manuals. Choosing wood ash instead of chemical lime yeast instead of factory pellets. Onion water instead of synthetic hormones is not about nostalgia. It is about resilience. These methods persist because they adapt. They function without dependency. They work when stores are closed and supply lines break. As evening settles and the garden quiets, you begin to understand that abundance is not excess. It is continuity. What the kitchen provides, the garden receives. What the garden grows, the kitchen returns. In that loop, independence takes root. This is not just land stewardship, it is inheritance. And every careful choice you make passes that inheritance forward.